to go? I mean, do you have some legislation ready to go to reform the healthcare system? I mean, do you think that there needs to be healthcare reform?
Well, of course. Like all Americans, I perceive that there are problems associated with this. Unlike those who voted to pass this, I believe that the entities that have the kind of power to enact legislation, sweeping legislation dealing with most of these issues, are states and not the federal government. It is, after all, states that license doctors and nurses and hospitals and clinics and license and regulate health insurance companies and come up with a system of tort laws that determines how medical malpractice suits operate. And so all of those drivers are creatures of state regulation, not federal regulation. That's where the true comprehensive reform needs to occur, is within the states.
You also don't think that there should be federal tort reform law?
I tend to believe that many proposals for federal tort reform are not appropriate for federal legislation. I did not vote, for instance, for the last tort reform proposal that came through the Senate for that very reason.
Senator, the Attorney General were talking about the importance of Justice Kennedy's role. How do you think he was leaning based on the questions he was asking?
Based on the questions he asked, based on his demeanor, his body language, and his facial expressions, in the wake of the answers to those questions, I think he was leaning toward the proposition that the individual mandate is unconstitutional, that it exceeds Congress's power under the Commerce Clause. That conclusion becomes even more compelling, I think, even more inevitable when you couple it with a review of his writings on cases addressing questions of structural federalism.
What specific questions did he ask that made you think that?
Well, he asked a number of questions asking what the limiting principle is that exists in the event that the court were to conclude that the individual mandate is constitutional. What then would be beyond Congress's power? And that was significant. One of the opening questions he asked was, does the Commerce power include the power to compel people not engaged in commercial activity into commerce, into interstate commerce?
Senator, having worked for Alito, do you think there's anything that's perhaps what we wouldn't predict about his position? Complexity that if we just say he's in the conservative camp, is that too broad a thing to say since you know him?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Do you think that there's anything on this case that would be unpredictable in his position, since you know him? I
certainly don't want to describe any justice as predictable, because it doesn't, it's not a word I typically use to describe any justice. But based on his questions today and his demeanor in the courtroom, he seemed to me to be somewhat, not just somewhat, but significantly skeptical of the argument that Congress may compel people to purchase a specific kind of health insurance.
Senator, what did you think about the time? They discussed timing quite a bit. Like, basically, as you know, the state said that, well, I mean, they agree that you could compel people to purchase insurance, but only at the point of sale. And the government was saying, well, no, if we can at the point of sale, we should actually enforce. So
a lot of the arguments focused on that. That was an argument that Solicitor General Varela relied on extensively, and many of the members of the, here, do you want me to back up so you can get more people in? Many of the members of the court that seemed sympathetic to the Solicitor General's argument also brought up that point in connection with their questions.
Right, that Kennedy did, and so did Roberts.
Yes, a lot of the justices on both sides used that point as a way to frame things.
Just stay there.
Justice Kennedy and Chief Justice Roberts, I think, were following up on questions that their colleagues had asked, trying to drill down and make sure that they understood how those questions had been answered, wanting to make sure that they understood them clearly.
So you didn't read it as they saw credence in that argument?
No, I didn't think that they were saying, and I didn't think that anything about how they asked the question or about how they responded to the answers to their questions indicated that they thought that was a basis for upholding the individual mandate. I think they were trying to clarify the position of their respective argument counsel.
Senator, most Americans are forced to buy car insurance, for instance, because it's a public safety issue. And people who are for the health care law say, well, this is no different because, you know, if you don't have health insurance, taxpayers end up, you know, picking up the tab for those who don't have health insurance. So how is it different in this case?
Justice Sotomayor asked a similar question related to car insurance. I have two principal responses to that. The first is that it is states and not Congress that require people to buy automotive insurance. The second, and state power is of course different than federal power. James Madison in Federalist Number 45, in trying to convince the states to ratify the Constitution, explained that the powers of the federal government would be few and defined. Those reserved to the states would be numerous and indefinite. But as to the second point, that deals with car insurance, automotive insurance. You don't have to buy that as a prerogative of being a living, breathing human being on American soil. You may choose, regardless of what state you live in, not to purchase a car, or if you have one, not to drive the car. And if you do, you're not going to have to buy automotive insurance. This one is saying, just by virtue of having been born, just by virtue of existing on American soil, you must, under penalty of federal law, purchase a specific kind of health insurance. And one of the arguments made by Michael Carvin that I thought was if you're going to exercise that government, and the government imposing that power, imposing that requirement, needs to have what we call general police powers. The states have general police powers. Congress does not.